not the co-founders of the International Center for Ukrainian Victory to say welcoming remarks.
Various words of documents. But for this to happen tomorrow, we pray and let us forget.
Продовжуємо працювати. Слава Україні! Героям слава!
Thank you very much, dear colleagues. Thank you very much for joining us for today's roundtable discussions, which will be dedicated to the accountability for the Russian aggression, to the issues of the nuclear safety and security, and also the confiscation of Russian assets. My name is Olena Galushka. I'm one of the co-founders of the International Center for Ukrainian Victory, and you have just seen on the video the short recap of the year and a half of our activities. This has been super hectic period, of course. We've achieved a lot. By we, I mean we as Ukraine have achieved a lot, but we definitely need to keep mobilizing our partners to keep the momentum, because we still need more assistance and more help to achieve Ukrainian victory. And on behalf of us, Ukrainian female civil society leaders who were hosted here by the Lasky Foundation very kindly in the first days of the full-scale war, helped us to set up this advocacy platform and to focus mostly on mobilizing the international partners while our everyday issues were sorted out. We are extremely grateful to our Polish partners. We know this, we appreciate this, and we hope that our joint victory will happen much faster, and it would be our very big celebration. I'd like to pass the floor to my colleagues to tell a little bit more about the achievements and about the results of our work, about key priorities, and after we will move to basically very clear and detailed discussions on the topics that you've seen on your agenda. Olga. Olga Ivazovska, the head of board of Opora and co-founder of the ICEV.
Hello to everyone. So we are always focusing on result. That's why we didn't discuss in detail this scenario of our first introductory speeches. But I want to highlight, first of all, that we have so many different topics on our agenda. And it doesn't mean that we are focusing on everything without details and without deep understanding why it's so important for having Ukrainian victory at the end. Because we are looking for society needs, we are searching what is in Ukrainian hands, because we use in surveys, analytical reports, materials, we are using documentation of different processes, and we are having our aims because of Ukraine society interests, not just because we're thinking that it will be useful for Ukrainian citizens. few months ago, we did a survey and we asked Ukrainian citizens in Ukraine, do they want to have victory? Of course, the answer was yes. But how the picture of Ukrainian victory will look like for them? First of all, they are looking for having all Ukrainian territories at the end of the war under the Ukrainian government control. They want to liberate all inches of Ukrainian territories. It doesn't matter how many years ago it was occupied by Russia. We are speaking about Crimea or Donetsk or Lugansk or new occupied territory. The second most important for them for having Ukrainian victory is Ukraine's developed in the future. And it's not just about recovery and reconstruction. It's about modern Ukraine, which will use post-war period, even during war time, for having as much reforms as it possible to be a part of EU and to be a part of NATO. And there are three main topics which can be under the negotiation in between partners and Russia and even Ukrainian authorities. It's EU membership, it's NATO membership, and it's about territories. But territories for Ukrainians are mostly about people, because 16% of Ukrainians were eyewitnesses of war crimes. Can you imagine how many from more than 40 million of Ukrainians had this experience? And 51% of them do not believe in a future of Ukraine or the end of the war without justice. So that's why we are advocating ad hoc tribunal under the universal jurisdiction, because justice will be the end of the war. So, and the main topic for having Ukrainian victory as soon as it's possible, because we don't have enough people's resources. And I have to speak about people not like about resources, but about special human capital of Ukraine, which is not endless. And this is about men which are fighting, women which are fighting, our refugees which looking for security abroad, and they want to grow in their children with Ukrainian identity. That's why they can't be abroad for many decades. That's why we are here. And we will be discuss in details all the topics which are interesting for Ukrainian citizens and Ukrainian society.
Thank you for coming here. We are blessed to be able to work for Ukrainian victory with amazing partners across the world who believe in impossible. It was impossible a year ago to have Abrams tank in Ukraine. Just a couple of days ago, the first Abrams tank has arrived. And I remember in September last year, we were coming with Ukrainian women soldiers to the US, explaining why it is important. It was impossible just a year ago to have German tanks fighting for Ukrainian victory. Impossible is now a reality. It was impossible a year ago, even negotiable a year ago, to have modern fighter jets in Ukraine. And now we are on the way where our pilots are being trained in Denmark, in the US, so impossible is happening. And now it seems to be impossible that Ukraine will become soon a NATO member, or that Russian $350 billion will be confiscated, or that Putin will be tried as a war prisoner for the war crimes. So we believe that these are all possible tasks, and all people who are here are not accidentally here, but you're here to make this impossible possible. And why we believe in that is because it's the matter of cost. Every day of the delay of some impossible things in Ukraine, somebody is paying for this delay with his or her lives. And we have limited amount of these lives. to be paid for bringing victory to our country. Therefore, nothing can stop us, and I believe nothing can stop you in our efforts with the International Center for Ukrainian Victory. We are glad that you are here. I also want to recognize two people and two organizations who are here who just reflect that impossible is possible. Lesa Ignatiuk Eriksson, the Association of Ukrainians in Denmark. Lesa and her team, amazing Ukrainians there, made a miracle possible in Denmark. So the Denmark is leading the F-16 coalition, and Denmark is one of the EU member states which providing a lot of military assistance. We are very thankful for that. Melinda Herring from Razom, our sister organization, our partner organization in the US, which also makes impossible possible. So our goal is to identify such kind of leaders, organizations, not necessarily of Ukrainians, but also of the local leaders, to work together and of course Natalka Panchenko, I don't know where is she, but yeah. It's like a family. we never had to deal with okay, let's advocate something in Poland to deliver to Ukraine. Well, Natalka is doing that that alone. So it's about building networks and building synergies for the cause, which is important not only for Ukrainians, but for everyone who is a human being and who believes in democracy and who believes in specific values of human dignity. So we are here together. It's our big mission, which will be discussed today into smaller pieces and smaller parts, because do small things and the big one will happen by itself. This is the words of Taras Shevchenko. So we are here today to do small things to make impossible possible. Thank you.
Dear friends, the International Center for Ukrainian Victory was established on March 4th, 2022, when no one at that time believed in Ukrainian victory, when still people, after the failure of Russian blitzkrieg, still were talking to us in Rzeszów, here in Warsaw, that, okay, you managed somehow, this blitzkrieg didn't happen, but still, what happened in 1 month? Let's see, maybe Russia will still occupy your capital. So I think it's really important to say that Ukraine is a reality changer, because all our partners who actually gave a wrong forecast about our future, so daily we are changing this, and we are thankful to the armed forces of Ukraine, because they are the true heroes and real defenders of values, dignity and freedom. So and it's really important why we are here. We are representing also the voices of those who are already in the heaven, who sacrificed their lives for us to be and to always remember that we have to be thankful for people and their families. And actually one of the key of our future modernization of country is to build the country, державу вдячності, the state of thanksgiving or gratitude to the families. I think this is one of the key, because we can reconstruct all damaged and destroyed buildings, but the most important is to guarantee justice inside Ukraine. And also why it's important that we are here daily, not just in Warsaw, but also in Washington, D.C., in Taipei, Taiwan, in Japan, Tokyo, everywhere. We already traveled to 20 countries, to our geopolitical partners, convincing them that we need to win faster. Because the strategic value of Ukraine is our people. People which will build stronger world and actually more secure world. And actually today during the Warsaw Security Forum, I remember how Zbigniew and Kasia in 2014 arrived to Ukraine and were asking for support to establish the Warsaw Security Forum. And today 10 years of anniversary, and we are thankful them for support. But actually what we keep hearing in different during different meetings, that we have to be prepared for the long war. I think we should not focus on timing. We should all focus on victory and how to make it happen faster. So because victory is achievable by having the military advantage. And this is why we at ICUV, we are advocating for weapons. And we need more anti-air defense system before winter, because this is the key security first, and then generators, transformers, and others. So more anti-air defense system is a key, together with confiscation of Russian assets. And also, it's already 10 years, almost 10 years when we all went to Maidan. In Kiev, we were defending our civilizational choice to be part of European family. Ukraine always, for 1,000 years of history from Kievan Rus, we belong to European family. So now one of our key strategic achievement would be, and we do hope that this year we will open the negotiations with the European Union, and next year at the Washington NATO summit, we will get the formal invitation to NATO. Because this year, unfortunately, the fear of some Western partners didn't make this happen. So we are thankful to everyone who is sitting in this room. There are lots of sisters and brothers in fight, and we are really thankful to all of you, because this is the marathon. And in this marathon, we are just not fighting for the existence of Ukraine. Because Russian genocide, and let's be frank and tell the truth, there is nothing different from Stalin man-made famine organized 90 years ago, when through Holodomor, genocide, millions of Ukrainians were suffering, were killed because of hunger. The breadbasket of Europe, Ukraine, and millions of people were dying because of hunger. And now millions of people will be suffering because of lack of Ukrainian grain, because of Russian weaponization of food as a weaponization of hunger. So this is really important, finally, to achieve such victory, such sustainable peace, when never again no one can attack any sovereign state, and it doesn't mean just Ukraine. And actually victory means also de-imperialization of Russian Federation, because the statehood of Russian state is imperialistic. And actually through reparation in the future, we hope Russian society will also feel this moral responsibility for the genocide that Russia is committing now in Ukraine. So thank you for all of you, and thank you for your support, and God bless Ukrainian victory better in 2023. Of course, we keep praying and thanking to our armed forces and the partners who feel this sense of urgency, because every hour matters. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this emotional and very meaningful introduction. And without any further ado, I would like to invite our panelists for the first panel. My name is Katerina Rybik. I have the privilege of being a moderator of the first panel that will be dedicated to the topic of achieving the criminal accountability for the crimes of aggression of the Russian Federation in the war against Ukraine. With that, I would like to invite to this panel Minister of Justice of Austria, Alma Zadic. I also would like to please join here at the table. I would like to invite the president of the Eurojust, Ladislav Hamran. I also would like to invite Olga Ivazovska. And also I would like to invite Mitek. Unfortunately, I haven't seen. Yes, great. You made it. Excellent. And as he's joining the panel, I also would like to mention that unfortunately, due to the shutdown in the United States, two of the congressmen would not be able to join our panel today. Well, what are we going to talk about in the next hour? We are going to talk about a lot of technical issues. We are going to talk about accountability mechanisms. We are going to talk about what are these mechanisms that are already in existence, what mechanisms civil society and states and international organizations are advocating for. But also we're going to talk about people, because you know that in the ever-growing number of war crimes in Ukraine, there is a human life behind a digit. And the millions of Ukrainians are being affected. And in order to start this panel, I really would like to invite Oleg, to kick us off with the opening remarks. Oleg, and as he is joining us, Oleg is a teenager from Ukraine, from Lugansk region. He is now working together with the Voices of Children, and he has already seen the worst of this war. He was stuck in Mariupol for 40 days as he was seeking peace and safety. And I would like to invite Oleg to share his story with this audience. Please, Oleg, join us.
Усім привіт, мене звати Олег. У мене велика сім'я, 2 брати.
Big family, 2 brothers, my father, my nephew, my grandmother.
I'm 16 years old, and I have a big family. I have a grandma, I have an aunt, 2 brothers, and father.
Earlier, I used to live in a small village of Hnutovo, not far from Mariupol. In 2014, when the war of Russia against Ukraine started, we kept hearing explosions. At that time, I was 7. Since that time, we've been living next to the front line.
I used to live in a small village of Hnutovo near Mariupol, and in 2014, when the war of Russia against Ukraine started, we firstly heard the explosions. I was 7 years old at that time, and this was, since then, we lived near the front line.
On the 24th of February last year, at 2 a.m., I woke up because of powerful explosions. The first Grad missiles attacked our village. That's how the full-scale war of Russia against Ukraine started.
2:18 a.m., I got up from the loud explosions. This was the time when the first Grad multiple rocket systems began the shelling on our village, and this is how the full-scale invasion of Russia against Ukraine started.
Вранці з нами приїхали наші знайомі.
In the morning, our friends came to pick us up from Mariupol, suggested to take us away to the city. At that time, it looked like a good idea, and we went to Mariupol.
Our friends came to us, and they offered us to go to Mariupol. And at that time, we thought that it is a good idea, so we went to Mariupol.
Згодом ми опинились в окупації.
Eventually, we were occupied.
У нас майже не було їжі та води.
We had almost no food or water, and let alone bread. They kept shooting every day, in the daytime and in the nighttime.
And to drink, I would say nothing about bread. And there were shootings all the day round. And it was shelling, and around the clock, day and night.
Одного дня ми зрозуміли, що їжі залишилося лише на...
One day we realized that we only had food for 3 days. My aunt and I decided to go visit my grandfather, who lived in another district of Mariupol. The city was all in smoke, but we didn't have any choice. And I was worried. I kind of felt that something was going to happen to us.
There is food left only for the 3 days. And my aunt and I decided to go to the other district of Mariupol, to my grandpa, to find food. And when I was very afraid and scared because all the city was in smoke, and I was very worried because I felt that something would happen.
Не встигли ми відійти від нашого підвалу, як біля мене впало 2 снаряди приблизно в 10 метрах від мене. Я сильно перелякався і попросив тітку повернутися. Але вона сказала, без їжі ми помремо. Тому тітка заспокоїла мене, і ми пішли далі через розбомблене місто.
we made just few steps from the basement, and 2 shells fell near us, like 10 meters that from us. And I was so afraid, and I asked my aunt to come back, but my aunt said that we would die without food, and that's why we had to continue our way through the totally bombed city.
Я можу багато розказувати про ці страшні 2 місяці в Маріуполі, про мертві тіла на землі, про чеченців, які забрали у нас велосипед, про воду, яку ми зливали з батарей та кип'ятили, про те, як прокидався серед ночі від голоду. Але жодна історія не передасть весь цей жах від життя в окупації.
I can tell you a lot of horrors from the life under the occupation, about the times that I got up in the middle of the night because of hunger, about the Chechens that stole my bike, our bike, about the dead bodies on the ground, or when we had to drain the water from the heating system and just boil it. There are a lot of stories that I can tell, but they wouldn't convey all the horror of the occupation that was when we were there.
Ми чудом вижили, ми чудом пройшли фільтраційні табори росіян. Вони погрожували вбити мене за смс-ку з прапором України, але зараз ми знаходимося на вільній частині України та в безпечному місці.
We survived by miracle. We miraculously went through the filtration camps of Russia, and I even had the threats from the Russian soldiers that they would kill me because of the SMS with the flag of Ukraine on my phone. But we went through that, and we are now managed to go to the safe space in the free part of Ukraine.
Ми займалися з психологами, але мені й досі страшно згадувати ті події. А мій молодший брат Гліб, якому зараз 8 років, і досі боїться залишатися наодинці.
We had the meetings with the psychologist, but I'm still afraid of remembering those events. And my brother Gleb, he is 8 years old now. He's really afraid to spend time alone.
Я більше не хочу боятися, і не хочу, щоб боялися інші діти. Адже тисячі дітей і досі знаходяться під обстрілами та ховаються у підвалах. Дуже важливо, щоб їм теж допомогли.
But I don't want to be afraid anymore, and I don't want other kids of Ukraine to be afraid. And nevertheless, there are thousands of kids that are going through the shelling and that are hiding in the basements right now. And that's why I want them to be helped too. Thank you.
I would like to thank Oleg and the voices of children for this testimony and for the courage. Because I think that all of you and all of us who have been dealing with the collection of evidence know that the foundation of collecting evidence is trust. So I would really like to thank Oleg for the trust that he has given to this panel and to all of our panelists and this audience at the Warsaw Security Forum. When you leave this room, please pay attention to the exhibit of the organization and the stories of Ukrainian children. And of course, I also would like to show you the book of the war through the voices of children, where you can find the testimonies and also can support the psychological, provision of psychological support to the Ukrainian children. So please don't pass by, pay attention to this exhibit, as there are many more stories to be heard, and there is justice to be found. And with that, if you allow me, I would like to open this panel and to give the floor to the Minister of Justice of Austria, Alma Zadic. And here, to kick us off, I really would like to take us back to March 2023. where in Brussels, I think that you said in the discussion of the legal consequences of the Russian war against Ukraine, you said in particular that to be able to hold the perpetrators to the account of those atrocities, we must quickly close existing criminal liability gaps. So now, 6 months later, are you satisfied how fast this gap is closing? Where we stand, and what would be your recommendations? Thank you.
First of all, thank you so much. I would love to immediately answer your question, but I have to say a few words about your story, because it's so important that it touched me a lot, because I myself am a child of war, because I grew up in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So a lot of those stories that I hear, and I'm fighting with tears, as you can see, a lot of those stories remind me of back then. And I think a lot of people in this room feel the same, otherwise we wouldn't be all of us sitting here together fighting for justice, because there's no peace without justice. And hearing all those stories and hearing all those horrors that in particular children go through, and knowing that it takes a life to go overcome them, it really commits us to do whatever we can to bring peace, but also justice. And I wouldn't be a politician if I would say, yes, we did everything greatly. No, we did not. I mean, there's so much we can do, of course. And we spent a lot of meetings together in the Council of Europe, discussing and trying, first of all, close the immunity gap, because the crime of aggression is still, there is still this gap. There's still this accountability gap when it comes to the crime of aggression. And crime of aggression is a leadership crime. And as the international community, we have not managed to close this gap. When we had the first discussions about this, our goal was to, on an international level, to make sure that the ICC has the competence to also have jurisdiction over the crime of aggression. Because if we want to give the ICC the legitimacy that it needs and the support of the international community, it also needs to be able to adjudicate the crimes of aggression. But this is not possible. We know the international sphere very well, so the next two steps would be either an international tribunal or a hybrid tribunal. And this is where the discussions are now at. How best, most effectively, and as soon as possible, close this impunity gap and be able to prosecute this horrendous crime of aggression on a leadership level. I have to say that one thing, and this is also my learning from Bosnia and Herzegovina, because when I got older, I worked at the ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia. One of the most important things is to gather evidence. Gather evidence right now as much as possible, even if there's no tribunal in place yet where we can prosecute the crimes of aggression, but evidence is key. Because we don't want anyone responsible for those horrendous crimes to go out without punishment. And this is why at Eurojust, and you will be able to tell much more about it, we agreed very fast that we need to enable Eurojust to gather evidence of war crime, evidence of genocide, crimes against humanity, and now, most recently, also evidence for the crimes of aggression. And the second challenge that we are facing on a national level, because I don't want to tell everything that you're going to say, on the national level, the challenge that we are facing is that a lot of people don't come forward to give evidence. In Austria, I issued a decree right after a few months after the invasion, telling that, or clarifying the law and saying that the prosecutors under the universal jurisdiction have the possibility to prosecute war crimes. However, we have no case by now in Austria, and it's also because there's not many people come forward and give evidence, and this is why having you here, testifying and saying and telling your story requires courage, requires strength, because it's not easy to talk about all of that what you've witnessed, and a lot of people, in particular women, who've been raped and who experience sexual violence, are feeling also a lot of shame. So we need to think about how we can set up mechanisms in place where these women feel secure, that they come forward and testify and issue the evidence without the fear of losing their dignity.
Thank you very much, Madam Minister. It's actually a very important point that I'd like to come back to, because building this trust is of extreme importance also for the evidence collection. But here, if I can park that question for the later of our discussion and give the floor to President Hamran, because the Minister already mentioned a number of mechanisms that you've been working with at Eurojust. And of course, again, in February was very rich for events. Yeah, in February, the ISPA, the the International Center for the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression against Ukraine, was established and announced, and it's been working so far. And of course, in parallel, the debates and the conversations at both political and technical level, because I think that these are the two levels that are very important to distinguish, continued. So can you reflect on the work of the ICPA, but also if you could add a little bit of the political dialogue on the dedicated tribunal to that discussion would be really great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have to again repeat what Madam Minister, perhaps future President, just said. Criminal accountability starts and ends with admissible evidence. So this is very important that we start collecting, analyzing, and helping all authorities in the evidence collection. And this is exactly the mandate of my agency, Eurojust. It's a European agency for criminal justice cooperation, and we support national investigations in organized crime, but in this case also in core international crimes. So we support national authorities which they started their own investigation concerning the core international crimes committed on the territory of Ukraine, and we realized that actually the response, the international response, is unparalleled. We today we count 24 national investigations, whether in Europe or beyond, and the national authorities started collecting from literally day one pieces of evidence concerning the Russian invasion. Now, when you have so many players, investigations, it's very important to understand who is doing what, who has collected what. And this is where Eurojust stepped in, because we said that we will coordinate all these national investigations. We want to understand where those investigations are heading to, what's the focus, how many pieces of evidence were already collected, from which regions, about what pieces, about what crimes. And we indeed got an extension of the mandate, and we established the core international crime evidence database. And this is a centralized tool in which we store and analyze already collected pieces of evidence in national investigations. Now, obviously, there are war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and there is a crime of aggression. And we understand that one of the biggest problems in today's world is how to tackle the crime of aggression. Indeed, we have a problem with the legal basis. And while the political discussions are ongoing, how to close this impunity gap and how to prosecute those who are responsible for the invasion. We as Eurojust and we as prosecutors, we decided that we cannot waste our time. We cannot simply wait months, if not years, to find a legal solution to all this, that we have to start collecting pieces of evidence concerning the crime of aggression. And we realized that they are actually on top of Ukraine. There are 4 other countries which they can prosecute actually and start investigation concerning the crime of aggression. The crime of aggression which happens in a different country. And this is based on the principle of universal jurisdiction. So we also understand that these prosecutors who started the evidence collection have a number of problems and issues. First of all, there is no legal experience. They didn't know which definition of the crime of aggression to use, where to start the documentation of the crime of aggression. Did the aggression start in 2014 or in February last year? Also, to what extent all the events should be documented, how broad the investigation should be, how the evidence should be collected, and so on. So all these were questions to which we wanted to provide assistance and help. Eurojust is an agency with expertise in judicial cooperation, so we decided that we will, on top of the financial support, provide also legal expertise, technical expertise, analytical expertise. So we will make sure that all these national investigations have everything what they need for a successful investigation. In parallel, there is an ongoing political debate about the tribunal. However, we anticipate certain outcomes, and therefore we adjusted the support to those investigations. How? First of all, every single collected piece of evidence will be translated into Ukrainian and English. So if one day there will be a hybrid or international tribunal, there will be already available evidence collected in national investigations, fully aligned with requirements about the admissibility and protection of human rights. So I cannot imagine any tribunal refusing this piece of evidence. And on top of having admissible evidence, also it will be translated into 2 languages. And this will significantly, we believe, speed up the investigation of the crime of aggression and bringing those who are behind it to justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. This is very essential, because I think that in your remarks you just said that this puzzle contains of so many different pieces, and all of these pieces are very, very important. And I'm sure that we will come back maybe with Olga's intervention to the question of the dedicated tribunal. But now, if you allow me to give a question or to ask a question from Mieczysław Boduszyński, and I just realized that I didn't give justice to your role and your background, because Mieczysław is a policy advisor on accountability of war crimes and currently former advisor, and that served at the office for the U.S. Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. However, I will be completely honest, when I read your bio, I was very intrigued, because this is a combination of a diplomatic career and an academic career and a career in Pentagon. So combining all of these different elements in your career and the focus of your work as a practitioner on the issues of democratization, on the issues of transitional justice, would you just tell us, if you would put yourself into the shoes of politicians, of states, what policy advice would you give the states and possibly civil society to achieve justice for the accountability of war crimes in Ukraine?
Thank you, Katya. Is this working? It's an honor to be here. So the first advice I would give would be to, and in fact it's advice that I gave when I left the Pentagon just a month ago. Now I'm an academic, so I can speak freely. The advice I gave to my bosses at the Pentagon is for the United States to reframe the way it understands and deals with the International Criminal Court, with the ICC, which has played this very central role in investigating atrocities, crimes in Ukraine. As many people in the room will know, the United States has a very complicated relationship with international criminal justice. Of course, the United States championed the creation of the Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals after World War II. Later, the United States championed the creation of the two ad hoc tribunals that came out of the conflicts in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia, and was part of the Rome Statute that created the ICC, but then didn't join in the end, for reasons that we can talk about if we have time. But I think that the fact that this conflict in Ukraine has reinvigorated, sort of re-legitimized, given new credibility, new meaning to the ICC, it's time for the United States to think of the ICC as another partner in the larger goal of building a rules-based world order. As well as, of course, bringing justice and accountability to Ukraine. And maybe the United States won't join the ICC, but of course, U.S. support to the ICC evidence gathering, which was mentioned by my colleagues, is very critical. U.S. capabilities and intelligence especially are very, very central there. And as you've seen in public reporting, President Biden did, in the end, make the decision to support the ICC on Ukraine, but I hope, I'm not in the government anymore, but I hope that gets fully implemented. And the second advice I would give, I guess, is to Ukraine. As a democratic state, as a European Union aspirant, Ukraine, although has accepted the jurisdiction of the ICC, it's not a member of the ICC. And maybe it's time for the Ukrainians to think about joining.
Thank you so much for this advice. Actually, this is an excellent segue to Olga. Olga, would you take that advice? That would be my first question to you. And how you think that the international community can further support Ukraine, and very importantly, Ukrainian civil society, whose role cannot be underestimated in the collection of evidence that both the minister and the President Havran mentioned during the panel. So what else can be done?
Thank you, Katya. Dear colleagues, first of all, I don't have fairy tales for you about success just through a few mechanisms or tools which can be developed very soon. And we are enough aware in Ukraine from the side of civil society and regular citizens that this process will not be very easy doable and it will not happen tomorrow. But the hope is so important for each of eyewitnesses and victims of war crimes in Ukraine and crime of aggression, which was the reason of those war crimes which we are collecting here or in Ukraine, that it is a key for Ukrainians to testify about each of the story as Oleg mentioned today. For Ukrainian civil society, it's important to have algorithm, how to collaborate with those who adopted decision and those who will be executive on the process for justice, tribunal, or war crime and crimes against humanity investigation. And when we're talking about that on a theoretical level, it looks like very easy things, because there are so many stakeholders and actors with strong political will to have those mechanisms which will help us. But when we are having this huge number of discussions, how, when, why, what is the boundaries for having at the end ad hoc tribunal because of crime of aggression, we are wasting our lives. And we need to be honest as Ukrainians, Ukrainian citizens and civil society, that for some of the groups, it's like a mission of their life already, because we know that former Yugoslavia tribunal was working for 25 years, and it's about long way. But when we are sharing our expertise or algorithms, how each of eyewitnesses can collaborate and communicate with police, investigators, prosecutors, there are so many stupid questions. Whom to call, how to write, how to start the process of conversation around this topic. And sometimes we do not have answers. And it looks like there are many people with political will, but still we have to work on practical mechanism. For Ukrainian society, as I mentioned, our survey, which we did during this summer, tribunal is one of the options which will end the war. So, and tribunal as mechanism under the universal jurisdiction can help Ukrainian society to end the war when the battle will be ended. But when we are working with, again, with those who were eyewitnesses, it's very difficult to find right direction because of huge mobility of Ukrainian as nation. We have already a stage of global Ukrainian nation. Each of the eyewitnesses can travel from one country of EU to another country of EU or even out of EU on a daily basis. So it doesn't matter whom they will testify today, if tomorrow they will be under another jurisdiction. That's why this idea and this practical stage already about joint database is very important to us, but we need to understand how to work through the local authorities if the eyewitness will change the location. How to be on the same page and how to do follow-up, because if we interviewed the people here in Poland and this person will change the address to Germany, the local prosecutors will have this interviewing, but they will not do investigation, they will not work with this eyewitness because this person just changed the location. So doable mechanism is about how to be effective even on the stage of huge mobility of Ukrainians. But the question about tribunal because of act of aggression is even more important for us, because each of Ukrainians suffering because of war, even if you were not eyewitnesses. You have a trauma because of war. You had to change all your life. You had to change the location. You had to suffering because of blackouts and other challenges which have direct connection with the war. And you need justice at the end. And you know who adopted the decision about act of aggression. And when you are listening so many excuses why it's so impossible to judge Putin or Lavrov or the head of defense system, it's not acceptable for regular civilian in Ukraine or for regular citizen. That's why my request to the officials or those who can adopt the decision, to be honest with each of us that first of all it's about political decision, and then lawyers can find a right mechanism for adoption this decision on a practical level. That's why call to action. Think about, not just think or talk about tribunal under the universal jurisdiction, but stop to looking for excuses why it's impossible now.
Thank you very much, Ola. I actually, would like here, before opening the floor for questions, because we have a little bit more than 10 minutes, to go back to every panelist. And if you allow me to reflect, I think that was very important in Ola's remarks was the issue of the political will, and how to maintain the political will to sustain the solidarity and sustain the coalition of various actors, both the bilateral and multilateral, to actually make justice a reality. And I also would like to pose another question of trust that Madam Minister mentioned in the beginning, which I think cannot be looked at in the isolation when we talk about another aspect, which is the political will and the sustainable solidarity. So if I can just very quickly ask Madam Minister, the President Havram and Mieczyslaw Buduszyński, what would be your reflections? How to maintain the political will at the international level in the search for justice? And how do you see this building of trust so that we actually are able to collect the evidence? Please.
Difficult question. To put it short, I think one of the most important things that was mentioned on this panel and that I think has a strong political impact is what you advised to the U.S. Department of State, because having the Defense Department, because having the US support the ICC is, I think, of utmost importance to accountability mechanisms. Is the because all the other things that we were talking about, building ad hoc tribunal and whatever, the surrounding things that you just mentioned is only because there's not enough support for the ICC. Because if we had this support from the very beginning, we wouldn't be talking about what tribunal we should establish. So I think this is one of the most important, in my opinion, humble opinion, most important advice that could have been given to the US, because, and I wished on the international level that we live on a rule-based world order. But unfortunately, this is not the case yet. There is the rule of power. And if the powerful nations support the ICC, one day we will get there and we will have the rule-based world order, because that should be our ultimate goal. And then there is enough political will and no room for discussions if we have such a horrendous crimes to prosecute effectively. And the second issue was the issue of trust.
Yes.
I think, I mean, it's a lot of what you also mentioned, a lot of those practical issues. What do the people do when they are somewhere? Whom to approach, whom to call, where to submit evidence? And I think there's so much we need to do to reach out to refugees and to try to establish the trust between Ukrainians living in our countries and the authorities in our countries, because it's not easy to come forward to the police, and then very often the police also doesn't know what to do with this evidence, and I mean, thank God there's Eurojust to collect and coordinate all of this. I mean, I think that was one of the key implementations on the European member states level, but nonetheless we need to make it practical in the member states.
Yes, thank you. Mieczysław, would you like to pick up there as Minister addressed you?
Thank you, Minister, for those kind words. Just to be clear, the U.S. has supported the ICC in other situations, in its investigations of African situations and so on. The tricky thing about the Ukraine investigation was that the target is a non-state party, Russia. U.S. is a non-state party. That was the objection. I think that the way to build trust and political will, again, maybe speaking about the U.S. context, is to, when I said reframe how the ICC is seen, it has to be reframed for certain parts of the U.S. national security establishment. And here, you mentioned the Defense Department especially, right? So you have to, I think, talk about it in terms of things like deterrence, in terms of being another tool in the toolbox to marginalize would-be aggressors, autocrats, dictators. And in fact, if sometimes it's assumed that autocrats and dictators don't care, even dictators like Kim Jong-un in North Korea don't care about things like international justice, but in fact they do. They do care about their reputation, and we've already seen some effects of these arrest warrants in terms of, Putin's ability to travel and so on. Aggression is a little bit tougher because there, the U.S. and some other powerful states came together in Kampala, as you know, to water down that the possibility for the ICC to prosecute aggression. I think the U.S. is on board with this mechanism, but there's some disagreements, as the minister mentioned, between different countries. So there's still a road ahead there.
Thank you, President.
Thank you so much. What I would like to bring to the table and to bring a little bit of different perspective here. And this is the perspective of people like Oleg. Because what is at stake here is the trust of people in democracy, trust of people in European values, and trust of people in institutions, democratic institutions. So it's our own each responsibility and brevity to simply being able to look into eyes of many victims who suffered all these atrocities in the war. And we have to simply ask ourselves, have we done enough? that we can look into eyes of all victims. I think that the process for victims is particularly slow because they would like to see results, immediate results. However, justice is a little bit slower than we would all wish because we operate in a very complex legal environment, geopolitical environment. However, I would like to also share a very positive message. When the invasion of Ukraine started, already in less than 1 month, there was already an international joint investigation team established. This was the fastest ever international response to an armed conflict. We never witnessed so many national investigations, and we never witnessed so much determination at the political level to end the impunity. We just have to make sure that we continue in this path and in these efforts, because I think that we all, as international community, owe this to people of Ukraine.
Thank you so much, specifically for highlighting the moral obligation before the victims of the war crimes. I think that keeping that human aspect of justice is incredibly important. Well, I would like to thank all of the panelists, and I'm mindful of time, but still we have 5 more minutes, so I really would like to open the floor to at least a couple of questions to the panelists. And please, if there is, please go ahead. I have the...
Thank you for the very interesting panel. I apologize for the U.S.-centric question, but since we're talking about this aggression tribunal, how do you reconcile the Ukrainian preference for an international tribunal on aggression versus the United States government preference for a hybrid tribunal? We don't have time to go into all the reasons for that, but I do think that that's an important question that ought to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And one more question from the audience, if there is one. Yes, if you wouldn't mind, thank you, to pass the microphone. Thank you so much, Andriy.
Yeah, thank you. I had like question, but specifically for Ms. Zadych. I'm very grateful that you were first today to raise the issue of special tribunal as the more realistic alternative for the investigation of crime of aggression. But I would like to hear maybe some more specific information and answers on behalf of Austria, the country you are represented. As Austria is a part of the core group on the Special Tribunal of Aggression, my question is which model of the future tribunal is Austria supporting and based on what reasons? Thank you.
Thank you. So I'd like to take it back to the panel. We have one specific question. Maybe we will start again with you, Madam Minister.
Sure, you mentioned correctly, since the beginning of 23, we are a member of the core group to establish the special tribunal, and I think both of you raised the very core of the issue that is being debated now, whether, because unfortunately we have seen that the ICC won't be able to prosecute crimes of aggression. So the only two options that we have is establishing of an ad hoc international tribunal or a hybrid tribunal. To be completely honest with you, I do believe that it would be important. If we have an international tribunal, it needs a broad international support, and in particular, to have global acceptance. So international support also means that it will be necessary to have it on a broad international level. And because, as we have heard, adjudicating those cases takes long, and we need and in particular after the verdict is there, you will need throughout this time, you will need international acceptance and international support, in particular at the end of the proceedings. That's why, of course, my preference would be an international one. But if there's no possibility to find any other means, we need to, or to convince other states to go along. We need to find a way to close the impunity gap. And I know that there are also other discussions whether we can have a third option. But the broader the international support, the more important, I would say, in this respect. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Anyone would like to add anything? Olga, please, and then Vyacheslav.
Very short answer to your question about hybrid tribunal. It depends on what type of hybrid are we talking about. Because if it will be in Ukraine, under Ukrainian jurisdiction, but with foreign investigators, it will not be useful at all at the end. You know, because one arrested warrant signed by investigator of ICC has more outcomes than all of these discussions and all of thousands of court decisions which will be produced by Ukrainian judicial system in the future. That's why it's political decision. And you have to develop political will in each of the societies which already supported idea to have justice and to help Ukraine, because mechanism doesn't matter. And this mechanism has to work on Ukrainian side to be respectful by third countries, even if they are not a part of core team or those who are participating on pro-Ukrainian alliance all over the world. So mechanism does matter. That's why we are looking for hybrid or under international jurisdiction, but with trustful from third countries mechanism.
Thank you so much. Please go ahead, Mitek.
Answer your question. I think that the U.S. hopes that it will convince the Ukrainians and other countries. I think the Baltic countries, Lithuania especially, are also in favor of the fully internationalized mechanism. But there's still a long road ahead. I think it has to do with some technical issues, including head of state immunity and other things. So I think for the U.S. that position is not going to change. But I just want to make one final point about sort of, the momentum of these things. We've seen in the past, if you look at the ICTY, where I know the minister, I think, worked at one point, you saw over time, for instance, the European Union in lowering the level of conditionality that it applied to Serbia at some point, because people, it was going on for a long time, and we were afraid of the nationalists in Serbia and so on, right? So these kinds of things are going to come up. I think they're going to come up for Ukraine. I think at some point also it's possible that, Ukrainian units might be also caught up in investigations, which Ukraine will have to face, right? It's hard to be the victor. God willing, Ukraine will be the victor soon, but also be the target of investigation. So there's so many things that'll make the momentum hard to keep. And when I said that we need to reframe how we see the ICC, especially speaking for the U.S., I didn't mean to instrumentalize it either, because we saw in Libya, when the UN Security Council referred the Libyan situation to the ICC, we saw an initial sort of flurry of enthusiasm, and then people sort of, started to walk away from it. Well, maybe we need an off-ramp for Gaddafi and so on. So I think maintaining that momentum is really, really important, and we have, a lot of recent historical cases to help us.
Thank you so much. I think on this note, we really have to end, and I would like to thank all of our distinguished panelists, and I would like in particular thank Oleg for his contribution to this panel, because we've managed to keep this panel technical, practical, and emotional. And if you allow me to conclude with a personal note, I have 3 children, and on my first trip to Ukraine after the liberation of Bucha, my 10-year-old, 9-year-old at that time son asked me, "Mom, what did you do for Ukraine today?" So I really would like to leave us all with this question. I really wish that we all know the answer to this question, and justice becomes a reality for the millions of Ukrainians. Thank you so much for this amazing panel, and a very big thank you to the audience for being with us. Thank you.
Second discussion, second panel that will be related to the Russian impact on nuclear security. And I would like to invite our distinguished speakers.
Я буду говорити українською, щоб вони дякую.
Сідай біля мене, будь ласка. Yes, dear guests, we are continuing the discussions. We are starting our next discussion, and I'm inviting all the speakers to the panel. So let's start, but I think we're missing one speaker. Yes, please let in everyone. Hello.
Yes, nice to meet you. Okay, great. Hi, hello. How are you doing? Welcome.
Yes, so the second panel of ICUV component will be on Russian impact on nuclear security worldwide. My name is Victoria Vatsitska, will be your moderator for today. I'm the advocacy director, specifically focusing on energy and critical infrastructure. And we have a very good panel today of distinguished guests and speakers and people with a great knowledge of the subject. I hope that the doors will be closed soon, so there isn't much of the noise coming up from outside. Yeah. So let me first introduce our panel. We have, if you don't mind, gentlemen, I will start with ladies. We have Rebecca Harms, member of European Parliament, former, yes, but you're still, for as long as you were, but you're still a member, but just during the first 2004 till 2019. We have Olga Babi. She is a representative of National Commission for State Regulation in Energy and Utilities of Ukraine. And Olga will speak in Ukrainian, and please use your heads for the translation. We also have Philip Patterson, and we have Nicola Tenzer. I hope I've pronounced your last name correctly. Thank you. Without further ado, I really want to start with the presentation, and I hope my colleagues from ICUV will help me with the presentation. Olenka. Of Philip Patterson, because he was planning to talk about the global perspective on the issues related to Russian impact on nuclear security worldwide. And for that, he prepared a couple of slides, and I do hope that my colleagues will help me to put them, yes, on the screen. Mr. Patterson, please.
Is this working?
It should.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. We have been working at the Center for the Study of New Generation Warfare, trying to educate the West that largely we are ignorant of how the Russians think about security issues, in particular military affairs. And as part of that effort, we've done a 2-volume study, which is published by my editor right here in the front row. here in Warsaw, and he himself is a great scholar, so he holds my feet to the fire on all the footnotes, etc. What we are going to talk about here is very small piece of new generation warfare. Consists of 9 elements, 4 non-kinetic, 4 kinetic, and 1 nuclear. So we're going to quickly just briefly talk about the kinetic. The nuclear. Now, since deterrence is in the eye of the beholder, for the West to be successful, it needs to understand how images or perceptions can become defense determinants. Now, the Russians perceive Western deterrence fundamentally different from how they envision their own concept. They contrast the two approaches as involving punishment versus restraint. For the Russians, the latter involves the use of nuclear weapons to prevent or constrain their use. Next slide, please. Now, Vladimir Putin has been at the center of contemporary Russian nuclear policy since he chaired the 29 April 1999 meeting, which took the decision to expand nuclear weapons from weapons of mass destruction to tactical technical instruments of the modern battlefield. Next slide, please. This decision led inevitably to the intention to transform the T-14 into the golden gun of the modern battlefield. A single tube mounted on an armored mechanized vehicle capable of both replacing an artillery battery and exploiting its own fire missions. Next slide, please. Now, the Russian General Staff has constantly practiced nuclear use for the purpose of war termination on terms favorable to Moscow. Stabilize the battle on the ground with sub-kiloton weapons, and, if necessary, destroy the Polish government and capital as an example of the risk of continuing the war. Now, I hope I've said enough about how fundamentally different the Russians think than traditional classical Western nuclear deterrence theory, so that we can have an interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your introductory notes. It's really very important to understand the differences of the way Russians and the rest of the world sees the same issue. And on that matter, I would like to continue this discussion. I would like to really hear the thoughts that Mr. Tanzer has to share with us on this particular subject.
Thank you very much. Yes. Okay. Thank you. I think my basic point is that we must not buy into the nuclear blackmail of Russia. We certainly have to pulverize, I would say, all the red lines in tries to impose to the West. Because otherwise, it will have consequences, not only, on Ukraine, but also consequences on Taiwan and other places in the world. Because if a nuclear power is able just to deter the West or trying to obtain a kind of self-deterrence of the West, then it means that a nuclear power, it could be China, could be Russia, could be Pakistan, could be India, could be any countries that could have, or Iran one day maybe, it would mean that basically we are not able, we the democracies, to resist this kind of blackmail. That's, the first point. The second point is that, of course, we have to observe, to monitor what the Russians are doing. Of course, from a technical point of view, you have the military intelligence for that, and certainly we have to see very concretely what they are trying to do, and we have, and certainly all the messages were passed, to convey the messages to the Russian government that if they are doing this kind of thing, we will do something that will have tremendous consequences, not only for Russia, because basically Putin doesn't care about the Russian people, but against Putin himself. And I think that's something that we have certainly to do. Otherwise, it will mean that we will do that we are doing right now, because we are still remaining halfway, you know, against Russia, and to counter, I mean, its war, which is all-out war, a war of aggressions and war of extermination, a genocidal war against Ukraine. I mean, we certainly have to do something without taking into account this kind of threats. And what I am afraid of is that I see that this kind of, I will call soft propaganda narratives are reaching the Western elite right now. And they are still buying into this kind of thing. And the third thing, and I think it's also very important to do that, is that we have to be very clear of what exactly the nuclear threat means. All kinds of nuclear weapons are nuclear weapons. We cannot make the differences between, I think, small weapons, and you were, I think, very interestingly talking about the sub-kiloton weapons, and the other nuclear weapons. There is no distinctions to make for us in terms of difference between especially the tactical weapons and the strategic weapons. And I think that's also very important. And also when it comes to the other threats, which are not exactly nuclear threats, for instance, the use of Zaporizhzhia power plant as a threat to the West, we have also to send very clear message to Russia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tenzer, and really appreciate your comments. And I think I totally concur with you on the fact that there is this notion, this feelings of fear of Russia using tactical nuclear weapons, right? And there is this concern that if he starts to lose a lot, then he might think about that. But I think what is missing in the discussion is really the fact that Putin is weaponizing civil nuclear assets in Ukraine and putting at risk not just Ukraine and Ukrainian territory, but if something happens to one or many Ukrainian nuclear power plants, then the effect will be felt not just in Ukraine, but other European countries as well. And this clear message to Kremlin and to Putin that use of tactical nuclear weapons, attacks on nuclear power plants, and most importantly, the critical energy infrastructure that provides safety and security of nuclear power plants. And this part, I don't see it at any discussions. It's completely missing, that this should be a red line. This should be a red line, and it should be a call for action from our partners, not just to punish Putin, but to provide Ukraine with proper protection. Closing the sky, providing us with all that we need to protect our assets in Ukraine in order to protect European countries and our neighbors as well. And on that matter, actually, the issue that relates to the critical infrastructure, energy critical infrastructure, and the role it plays, and the weaponization of civil nuclear assets in Ukraine. I really want to pass the floor to Olga, and we all want to hear your remarks on that issue or any other that you want to stress our attention to.
Hello, my English is not perfect, тому я буду говорити українською, щоб я могла...
That's why I'm going to be using Ukrainian so I could deliver the words that are important to you. When, on the 24th of February, the Russian troops seized the nuclear waste facility in Ukraine, on the 3rd of March, they occupied the Zaporizhzhia power plant. In Ukraine, 2 nuclear bombs were created that found themselves in the hands of the Russian military. You cannot differentiate here between bombs or not bombs. This is nuclear. When we talk about nuclear safety, we are saying that any nuclear waste, any nuclear fuel that has been seized by terrorist organizations is a nuclear bomb, where the edge is, because these are the things that threaten large numbers of people. Now in Ukraine, every day we are testing the protocols, how to avoid nuclear threats, because we have this nuclear bomb that can explode anytime because of improper operation by the Russians of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. The world has become very dangerous, because today in the world there is no place which, after such an act of aggression, may not be seized by any terrorist organization. And nobody would be held to account for that. Today in Ukraine, Putin and Russia are training how to avoid responsibility and accountability after they seize nuclear power plants. And what should we do? When we know what the situation is and what it should be, we have to answer the question what we should do. The key thing that Victoria said, we need to understand one more thing, that it's not just the power plant, but also the nuclear waste storage facility is a threat. And the threat emerges when, on the 27th of November, after a mass attack against Ukraine, the substations that take nuclear power from the power plant were destroyed, and we had to stop the work of the nuclear power plants. And that was the task of nuclear terrorism as well. Because if then, at that time, the Ukrainian dispatchers, operators, had not coped with that task, we would have had consequences. So now when we consider the nuclear threat in a large context, we have to think about how to protect critical infrastructure facilities, the stations, power plants, the nuclear waste facilities, and strange as it may be, uranium mines and factories, because any seizure by any military formation or a terrorist organization after what has happened in Ukraine can be never punished. What can we do? Today, Ukraine is living every day through new security protocols about what can be done. First, we can change the IAEA standards. We can change the standards of treating waste and develop proper legal practices that will become part of all the UN and IAEA protocols. Will tell us what waste is, how it should be treated, what nuclear fuel is, what operation protocols should be there, what is this special critical infrastructure that is related to nuclear generation facilities and how to protect it. That's number one. That's important. That what should be done now. As Ukraine is not a separate territory, it's a part of the European Europe and Eastern Europe, we can understand that these consequences can be felt by all the countries of Eastern Europe. So it should be a joint security and safety standard for the countries of Eastern Europe that we can all accept on the level of the European Commission as a safety standard. It can be regulated, it can be approved, there can be joint protocol actions by the neighboring countries in Ukraine if such consequences occur. The key thing here is that Ukraine must become a member of all the IAEA organs, because it's the country in the world that knows how to protect nuclear facilities and how to operate them under armed aggression. Our dispatchers, our operators, they know the protocols. They are the only people in the world who know how to prevent those technical horrors. And at every level, we have to say that Ukraine has to become a full-fledged member of IAEA and of all the UN advisory security bodies, exactly in order to share its practical experience and to move it into documents. You said a very good thing about how to prevent it, how to deter it. It's very simple. At the previous panel, we talked about the International Court and the law. The command to seize a nuclear power plant is given by Putin, but physically it is seized by soldiers who come to the power plant with weapons in their hands. They mine it and turn it into a nuclear bomb. Within the context of international law, if they say, all the international rules, that the physical persons who commit, who obey this order, that they would be criminally liable for it, which is equal to nuclear terrorism, very many soldiers who will do that may not do it. But this should be regulated on the level of international law. We've seen this experience. That's a key safeguard. The other part of the question within the context of international law is that we are trying to introduce sanctions against Russia. We understand that Russia has, we know that these sanctions about Rosatom, we don't have them, and we know why we don't have them, because Rosatom economically and technically is related to the delivery of nuclear fuel to many countries. We understand that, we recognize that, but there can be other sanctions of a different level. For example, the country that has committed such an act of aggression can be deprived of the right to enrich uranium in 2 or 3 years. And then other countries related to this country would look for other partners. So this is a multi-level task, which we now understand how can be implemented. I think that the Ukrainian experience has to become an example for all of the world. To say that the world has become dangerous, unless we can punish all those culpable of the things happening in Ukraine, the seizure of the nuclear waste storage facility in Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, unless we introduce new protocols, new rules of the game, then in any country of the world this can be repeated. And just looking at the nuclear power as safe power will no longer be possible. Nuclear power is the kind of power that would allow us to move to the green transition and to lead to sustainable economic growth in other countries. We have to pay for our safety, the safety of the world, and our experience that we're ready to share with all of you is very important. We have not only experience but proposals, and we are ready to jointly keep moving so we can quickly install those safeguards that will help us avoid those consequences in the future.
For your insightful analysis and specific recommendations, and I hope our European, American, other partners will pay attention to your recommendations, and there will be actions taken, especially with respect to nuclear terrorism. I want to continue with you, Rebecca. The question is, we're on the same page with you on evaluating the success story of IAEA, International Atomic Agency, and their performances on Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. We've seen the recent report of the Greenpeace, where they gave their evaluation of, from my perspective, absolute toothless position of Mr. Grossi and his team with respect to Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. But can you please brief us on your perspective of Zaporizhia nuclear power plant and what should be done, especially with respect to IAEA? Thank you.
Yes, thanks for inviting me and continuing this discussion about nuclear energy and the question whether we can still talk about guaranteeing safe operation after the experiences in the Russian warfare against Ukraine. I think the world until today misses to recognize what means Russian nuclear terrorism as part of the warfare since the very first day of this war in February 2022. I think the world also has not yet understood that a very influential member state of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Russia, so a very influential state in this United Nations organization, is responsible for nuclear terrorism in the war against Ukraine. And really, I say this so explicitly because I think on this fact, the world has still to wake up. Sometimes I'm wondering why it is so popular to talk about possibility of nuclear weapons applied in Ukraine, and in the same time completely ignoring that Russia is using since 18 months nuclear power plants in Ukraine like pre-installed nuclear bombs. This is happening while Russia is attacking energy infrastructure, the destruction of supply lines and the destruction of transformers in Ukraine. Several times on several days during last winter brought nuclear power plants in Ukraine very close to, you can say, on the edge of disaster. Like you said it earlier today, close to the Harrisburg scenario, we were in 2 days in 2 different nuclear power plants in Ukraine last year. That the West was not able to guarantee the adequate equipment to close the sky above Ukraine means that this risk of attacks connected to nuclear power plants, that risk is there every day, and while everybody is expecting new attacks and systematic attacks against energy infrastructure of Ukraine in winter, we have to prepare a better protection, especially also of the cities close to nuclear power plant Rivne, Khmelnytsky, Ukraine South, and Zaporizhia is very difficult, and third other case. I would like to remind you here that the occupation of Zaporizhia lasts meanwhile 18 months. The staff working on this site is under terrible pressure. The working conditions are far away from anything what is required for normal operation under safe conditions. So not only ongoing shelling close to the plant, but also torture and a lot of different threats against Ukrainian staff is continuing. The site has been mined, the surrounding of the site has been mined. We do not know to what dimension, but we definitely know that there are also mines on the site directly. The Kakhovka destruction has shown, also for the staff and the people around Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, that there are no limits for Russian warfare when it comes to infrastructure. So worst case is an idea which is present to everybody on site every day. Russia has, according to the recent reports, Russia has shelled Ukrainian forces ongoingly, so from a distance from 1 to 18 kilometers to Zaporizhia. So this war impact also has impact, or these ongoing war activities have also impact on the people who work and their ability to do their job in a proper way. the International Atomic Energy Agency, and namely Director Grossi, what are they doing with their task force? They are normalizing all this. So it's nothing else but normalizing these incredible act of nuclear terrorism. In fact, they never really met their mandate, and everything they did with their task force has no impact on the ground. Since some days, we know that they have exactly 4 inspectors on the ground at Zaporizhzhia. So I know the plant. I don't know who knows Zaporizhzhia besides my friends from Ukraine. It is huge. For me, it sounds like a joke to say with 4 men on the ground, you have anything like control. It's really a joke. But how comes? So I think so the role of Russia in the International Energy Agency, Atomic Energy Agency is behind all this. So not only we have Mikhail Khudakov, a former Rosatom manager, as the deputy managing director of IAEA. This Russian man, so former Rosatom manager, is also responsible for the whole department of nuclear energy at IAEA and for the safety standards. So his former colleagues, Khudakov's colleagues and friends probably, are participating in the act of terrorism at Zaporizhzhia. Is this normal? Where are the comments by IAEA? Why this Russian man is still in this job? I simply cannot answer this, but nobody is really systematically posing this question to IAEA. How comes? We talked a lot about sanctions, but I think IAEA is protecting Russia from sanctions. So there are several countries, I think 7 countries overall around the world, who have contracts with Rosatom, and supported by IAEA, Rosatom is engaged in new builds, nuclear new builds in 7 countries. So among those countries, well, is Belarus. Yeah, we have some experiences with the famous new build in Belarus, but there's also Bangladesh, Egypt, Turkey, etc. And this activity, because this is kind of lifeline into the future also for IAEA and the nuclear lobby, this is, from my point of view, the mystery behind why we have no sanctions against Rosatom. They are very influential at IAEA, and from my point of view, we don't need to talk about global safety, nuclear safety, if we do not address this complete failure of IAEA.
Thank you, Rebecca, very much. Lots of food for thoughts and reflections. You mentioned in your speech Kakhovka Dam, and for myself, my colleagues, and for Ukrainians, it's an example where no preemptive actions were taken by our partners to prevent from such a disaster. We've heard numerous comments that Russians won't do anything, they are not crazy enough to do that, why would they put their soldiers at risk of drowning, etc., etc. But they did it. And guess what? There was no reaction whatsoever. No sanctions, no statements of saying, okay, enough is enough. We recognize that Russians are so ruthless that they can actually create such magnitude disasters after the World War II that are just of huge consequences. And not just, by the way, for Ukraine, but for the Black Sea region as well, because the consequences were felt in Romania and Bulgaria, etc. But no reaction. When we talk about Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in particular, and we explain that Russians can use, and they will not hesitate to use it as atomic bomb to cause a major disaster, should or when Ukraine is successful with counteroffensive? Where are preemptive measures? Where are statements? Where are communications? Where are those lessons learned from Kakhovka? What else should happen for the West to wake up and realize the true nature of the aggressor? I really would like to hear your voices, our distinguished guest, please.
Yeah, let us start by just saying that good policy cannot be built on the foundation of ignorance. And our goal with my publisher is to help Western specialists, security specialists, and here security is both non-kinetic, kinetic, nuclear. Element number 9, it's clear. Russia has told us a decade ago that the use of nuclear power stations is an instrument of war. All right? So what we're trying to do is simply lay out for people, look, you have to understand how the Russians think about things. Because if you don't do that, you can't, first of all, understand when they're lying to you, which is most of the time. And you can't understand where their pressure points are. I'm going to just give you a brief story. I was in a meeting between a 3-star U.S. Air Force officer and a senior policy advisor to the President of the United States. And they almost had a fist fight because the 3-star general said any nuclear use by the Russians requires a massive retaliatory response. And the policy guy said, that's why the president threw your ass out of his office, because he's not going to go and risk New York and Washington and Chicago when you can't even tell him whether we observed the nuclear use in Ukraine or a thermobaric weapon. All right? So what we're trying to do is explain to people, look, first thing you have to have is a foundation. You have to understand that Obama decided not to make partial fusion fraction weapons. The Russians decided to it. Putin himself took that decision. As a result, we are confronted with, if the Russians use tactical sub-kiloton weapons on the battlefield, what is the appropriate response? All right? Now, I can tell you what this administration, the Biden administration, has told the Russians. If you use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, we will destroy the Russian army in Ukraine. That's what they were told. And I don't think personally, from my observation, that we need any more than 2 Army aviation brigades with the Apaches to completely destroy all Russian forces in Ukraine. The point is, that's what this administration is doing. You have already seen the leading Republican candidate who said he's going to end the war in 24 hours. And it's not by threatening Moscow. So this is precisely why we need to understand we are already in World War III. And we are losing it. Not on the battlefield, but in non-kinetic fields where the Russians dominate elections through buying politicians and through the use of mass media to mislead our voters. Thank you.
Amazing, amazing comments. Thank you so much for all of your thoughts. Mr. Denzar, do you have to add? I really hope you will share your wisdom with us on this matter.
Yes, absolutely. I think I basically agree with what you're saying, and that's why I was advocating, since the beginning of the all-out war of Russia against Ukraine, even before, I must say, since 2014, massive retaliations against Russia. That's basically what it should have done. We should have done even before, after Georgia, in Syria as well. Okay, that we perfectly know the story. Just to very brief remark, if we consider what Russia Russia is doing and the Russia blackmail, and also the doctrines as updated in the document of 2020, by Russia. The nuclear use is something that appears to be without any kind of reasons. The fact that we say, well, we have to show some restraints, we have to de-escalate this kind of things, won't in any event prevent, if any kind of action by Russia. So the question is not what we are doing to try to prevent this. If we want to prevent this, we have to take action, full stop. And I think that's very important to have this in mind. The idea that we can prevent something by, having a kind of mild stance, nice words with Russia, doesn't lead anywhere. That's the first thing. The third thing, maybe a little bit disagreement with the wording, sorry. I wouldn't use personally the wording World War III. Because the wording World War II is commonly used since a very long time by the Russians propagandists to deter us. So basically we are not in a kind of World War III. We have all the threats that you perfectly describe. I fully agree on that. Especially non-kinetic warfare, disinformations, buying a lot of propagandists in the West, trying to blackmail the people. That we perfectly know. But it's not exactly World War III. And I think it's very dangerous also to use these words, because then we have the public opinion in the West. And if we use the wording World War III, or if we insist too much of the nuclear threats from Russia, that's basically, it will mean that at the end of the day, Russia would have won. Because that's what they want to do. They want us to be afraid. Because then there will be the pressures on the government saying, okay, please do not deter Russia, do not try to do something, let's negotiate, etc. So I think we must not be afraid. And I think that even what we are talking, between us as specialists, maybe up to a certain point, must not go out of the room. And we have to say, well, we will act, we will take actions, whatever Russia is doing. We have basically, and I will finish with that, we have to set the agenda. Because since 23 years, Putin was the agenda setter. Also on nuclear blackmail. Also on using all the threats, with also Zaporizhzhia threat. No, we have to reverse, the stance. So to say, well, that's what we want to do. That's the kind of world order that we want. We will take action decisively on that. And we must not pay attention to what Mr. Medvedev was saying. For instance, you remember that Medvedev was talking about, the four horsemen of apocalypse and these kind of things. I studied, at length, all the narrative also by the Russian Orthodox Church on nuclear blackmail about the end of the world. That's basically a kind of millennial thinking. And we have certainly not to buy into that.
Yes, thank you. And I just want to make one comment. If our partners will not address promptly and decisively the nuclear terrorism, Russian nuclear terrorism, the stakes will go up, they will grow, and if it's not stopped now, the things might get even worse. And giving up to terrorists, it's the worst strategy. The whole history of the world showed, and I think we all are adults to understand that we cannot bound towards the threats from the nuclear terrorists. We should close this session, and I really want to give the floor to Olga and Rebecca for the closing remarks. If you have something to add to what we were discussing.
Завтра в Україні закінчиться війна.
Tomorrow in Ukraine, the war will be over. There will be tomorrow. And this tomorrow will come one day when the war will end. the nuclear generation facilities will be liberated and free, because I don't think that in the international law there is no provision allowing people to seize nuclear generation. Russia will leave Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant because otherwise it's a crime. We live in a civilized, legal, democratic world, and it should be so. All of it will happen. I believe in it. But I have a question. How will the world live after that? By operating its nuclear facilities, unless it changes the rules. If this happens in Ukraine and war is over, and I do believe that all of this will be set free, but if nothing changes in the world, because in France, in the UK, in the United States, in any country that has either nuclear power plants or uranium mines or nuclear waste storage facilities, what is happening in Ukraine now can happen there as well. If the world wants to see how it happens, well, please, you can have a look. You can come to Kiev, which is quite safe. You hear the air raid alarm. It's a missile attack, and nobody knows whether the missile is not targeting the nuclear waste facility in Chernobyl. That's not far from Kiev. One will be able to feel it. And that's what we live with every day. If the world does not believe that this is true, that this is happening, one can come to Ukraine. Well, with all the safety measures, but to feel it, to see it with one's own eyes. If there is not enough evidence, if everything is kind of not very clear, why wouldn't people, decision makers in the IAEA, at NATO, regardless of what their countries of origin are, international courts, why wouldn't they come to Kiev? We will make it safe for them. We will show it to them how it happens every day. Because every day when I go down to a bomb shelter, when there is a missile threat, we have to go down because that's something that makes your life think. I don't want to think about Russia. I don't want to speak about what Russia is. I don't want to blame it. I don't want to speak about why they do it. I want to do everything so that tomorrow it will not happen again. That's why all of our efforts, all of our patience, all of our knowledge and experience of Ukraine should be used so we can join our efforts together with the countries of the European Union, the international community, so that it will not happen tomorrow. When on the 3rd of March, Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant was seized, my friend called me and said, "You are irresponsible mom. I'm taking your children away. How can you stay in Ukraine?" I talked to my children. They said, "No, we won't go anywhere." I had to call her back and tell her something that my children don't want to leave, and explain to her. I called her and I told her they have refused to go because if something happens to the Zaporizhzhia power plant, the rest of the world should know it. And we have to change the rules of the game. We have to get together so it doesn't happen. We have to establish safeguards and make such things impossible in the future.
So, yes, it's goodwill, but is goodwill enough? So I joined this morning the panel where also Vika was discussing about the future of nuclear energy, and none of the participants of the panel was able to only dedicate 1 minute or less of their speaking time to the new issues, the new challenges for the nuclear sector because of the experiences in Ukraine. And so my personal opinion and my political opinion, it's the same in this case. I think the lessons from this Ukrainian situation have still to be learned. IAEA and United Nations and some of the states also in the West are so far blocking a learning process and also a true confrontation with the new experiences. Without learning from these experiences, it will be impossible in a world which is less safe and is facing so different challenges for stability. I think nuclear is not a good option. And so facing in IAEA that trade and industry interests are winning over reasonable experiences from what we see in Ukraine is also not a very promising situation. So from my point of view, the whole idea of atoms for peace, that's the slogan of IAEA until today and the United Nations slogan, this whole idea has totally failed since the United Nations IAEA is accepting, is tolerating Russia as a leading member in spite of the fact that Russia is responsible for nuclear terrorism in Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Just want to close our panel by saying that there is this great discussion on the nuclear renaissance that should happen or is happening all over the world. But I think this subject can be discussed only when the world has answers, especially with regards to the security issues that we were discussing today on the panel. Until that time, it's absolutely irresponsible even to talk about nuclear renaissance. Thank you.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much.
We are starting the next panel in 2 minutes, so please don't go away. Thanks.
A ja planszę w ogóle wyświetlam, także luz. Daj mikrofon.
And even when I'm in
Hello.
That's always from so very many people already.
Запущена ракета. Ракета вже летить. підтверджували. Ми ж, власне, чому в кінці кінців перекомбінували і зробили вашу залученість в дві панелі, ну тому що ми розуміємо, що експертний рівень вашого всі готові говорити про всі готові говорити про war crimes, як воно все важко, складно. Немає жодного. Yes, I think we should, well,
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. We'll start in about 2 minutes. The session went a little over time, so we're waiting for a few people, but very soon we'll start. Thanks. If I can have your attention, we will start the next session of this afternoon. It is a session of the track at the Warsaw Security Forum organized together with the International Center for Ukraine Victory, who, as I'm sure you know, is a partner organization to the Pulaski Foundation and is, I can honestly say, a great friendship of ours because the founders are great and dear friends and is an organization for whose work we've been supporting and an organization that we very much believe in. So honestly, I think this is an incredible job that all of the team behind ICUV has been doing, and I really wanted to kick off with those words. That said, ladies and gentlemen, we have an incredibly important and difficult subject to address at this session, and I really look forward to a lively discussion also with people who join us here in the room, and it is also streamlined online, so we can really speak to the world about this important subject on how we actually tackle the issue of seizing Russian assets for the benefit, for the just cause of rebuilding Ukraine. And we have some great panelists, but before I introduce them, I'd like to give the floor for some opening remarks by a very special guest. We have with us Ms. Irina Mydra, who is the Deputy Minister of Justice for Ukraine. Welcome. Please, a round of applause for our guest. And if you would be so kind to set the stage, I might add my name is Marcin Buzanski and I'm a senior advisor with the Pulaski Foundation. But Irina, now the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Marcin. First of all, I'm pleased to welcome all the distinguished participants of this panel discussion. And on behalf of the government of Ukraine, I want to express the gratitude to Kazimir Pulaski Foundation for organizing the Security Forum and to International Center for Ukraine for this unique opportunity to participate in the very important discussion on advocating for Ukrainian victory. Russia's act of aggression against Ukraine has caused widespread damage and destruction on a scale unseen since World War II. And the size and scope of the damage is yet to be calculated and appreciated, but various studies estimate the cost of reconstruction and recovery of Ukraine in the hundreds of billions of dollars. These studies do not take into account, do not evaluate the cost of human loss and suffering by Ukrainian people, with at least tens of thousands casualties among the civilian population, millions of people who were forced to seek safety outside the country. Ukrainian authorities recorded over 100,000 instances of war crimes committed by Russian invaders, including execution, torture, sexual and other gender-based violence. And similarly, the long-term macroeconomic, socio-economic and environmental and other consequences of Russian aggression are difficult to estimate, but definitely they will increase this amount by an order of magnitude. Winning the peace is not less important than winning the war. Winning the peace shall lead to successful reconstruction and recovery of the state and its nationals. And payment of reparations by Russian Federation is inevitable, is an integral part of it. And it is inevitable not only for reconstruction of the state and compensation to the nationals, it is inevitable for the restoration of justice in the first turn. So for Russia to pay the damages to all victims is not merely a moral and ethical imperative, it is a legal obligation under the norms of international law on state responsibility. Russia is obliged to compensate all the suffering of Ukrainian citizens, all the economic losses of private and public businesses, to pay for all the damages of public and state and private property. And Ukraine has proposed the concept of the compensation mechanism, comprehensive compensation mechanism last year. And on November 14, 2022, the United Nations General Assembly has endorsed this proposal by adopting the resolution on the furtherance of remedy reparation for aggression against Ukraine, which recognized the obligation of Russian Federation to bear legal consequences, including making reparation, which recognized the need to create an international mechanism for reparation for damage, loss, and injury, and recommended the member state to create an international register of damage. So envisaged that compensation mechanism should be consisted of three main components. First, it's International Register of Damage, which has already been launched in the Kingdom of the Netherlands by the enlarged partial agreement of the Council of Europe, and now it is in the active phase of its commissioning. 43 states and the European Union have joined the register. The second component is the International Compensation Commission or Claims Commission that will have the mandate to adjudicate the claims collected by the register and award the amount of compensation due in each case. And the third component is International Compensation Fund that will accumulate money from which the compensation decisions will be paid. The register constitutes the first component of the comprehensive compensation mechanism, but without introducing it as a whole, without creating the Claims Commission and Compensation Fund, without enabling of legal mechanism that would allow the transfer of so-called Russian assets into this compensation fund, which will be the source for paying compensations to the very victims and to the state, the register will remain only a database of damages, which is not acceptable to Ukrainian government and to
our people. Thus, Ukraine urged the states to invoke the responsibility of Russian Federation, and with the Security Council unable to work to act in this particular instance, states acting in furtherance of UNGA resolutions, especially the resolution on furtherance of remedy and reparation for aggression, can take action to establish by an international agreement a political and administrative fact-finding mechanism based on the premise that Russia is liable under international law for damage, loss, and injury caused by aggression against Ukraine. So Ukraine, together in cooperation with the International Register of Damage, is now working on the development of the international agreement, drafting of the international agreement, seeking to enforce an existing obligation of Russia to make reparation, because to pay reparation does not depend on Russia's consent. It's already existing legal obligation. So what we have to do to find the mechanism how to enforce this obligation. And we will propose soon to the global community, to the states, the draft of international agreement on creating the Claims Commission and Compensation Fund, which will also address the issue of confiscation of Russian assets. So what are the challenges with regard to confiscating of Russian assets? They can be grouped into three main categories: domestic law, international law, and I would say miscellaneous, which is basically policy challenges, which meaning, would it be a good idea to confiscate the state frozen sovereign assets if it is legally available? Or it might create a bad precedent, as many states are afraid of. So with regards to domestic legislation, here it's fundamentally is not a problem. Parliaments make laws, parliaments can amend laws, unless we run some insurmountable challenges, constitutional challenges. There is no real obstacle to enabling the confiscation of Russian assets and transfer them to the International Compensation Fund. Might be some potential constitutional issues with regard of right of private property if you speak about the assets of private individuals, but typically this right is not absolute and it can be modified. International law. The real battlefield is international law. So here the position of Ukraine is very clear. Since Russia has committed egregious violations of international law and owes the obligation to make full reparation to Ukraine and the victims, it would be proportionate and it would be non-punitive. It would be restorative to temporarily deny protection of sovereign immunity and make Russia pay reparations by repurposing Russian sovereign assets. Fundamentally, if the use by way of confiscation of otherwise of sovereign assets would ordinarily be inconsistent with the principles of sovereign immunity, then an argument can be made to use the countermeasures of the states, by the states, in order to make it possible. Because what is countermeasure? Countermeasure is by definition would normally be illegal, but if it is justified by particular circumstances, such as an international wrongful act by a state against which such countermeasure is aimed, then it will be legal. And the third block of concerns or challenges is policy aspect. Many states are worrying that if today we repurpose Russian state assets, then tomorrow Western states can seize the assets of other states. So what about Global South, Middle East, Africa? Should they be worried about? And here the answer is simple, to our opinion. Do we really want to live in a world when the aggressors can commit mass human rights violations, horrible atrocity crimes, crimes against humanity, and continue to rely on the rest of the international community punctually observing sovereign immunity? It's enough to highlight how extraordinary the magnitude and the nature of Russia's gross violation of international law is. It goes not only about the notion that violated the prohibition to use the force. We are talking about mass human rights violations, breaches of international humanitarian law, international human rights law. We all have seen what had happened in Irpin, Bucha, and Mariupol. And we are talking about acting in violation of ICJ provisional orders, systemic non-compliance with European Court of Human Rights judgments. So these concerns of the states of making precedent may be groundless, unless other states may want to follow Russia's conduct. And the proper guardrails can and should be established not to create precedent. That's why Ukraine believes that the states should stop seeking excuses under the guise of established norms of international law and fear of making bad precedents to justify their inaction in respect of satisfying Russia's obligation to make reparation to Ukraine and to victims through repurposing the aggressor's state assets. And finally, it will also serve as a policy of deterrence. Any state considering a future war of aggression will see that Russia's egregious violation of international order carries a cost, a high cost. Taking hold of Russian state asset is an in extremis remedy, but it responds to an extreme challenge to international peace, and there is solid legal ground for such countermeasures. And what is needed? The political will is badly needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Minister. This is an excellent, really, laying ground for our next discussion. I'd like to invite a few fabulous speakers. Olena Halushka, who is the co-founder of the International Center for Ukrainian Victory. She's joining us here from Kiev or Lviv, I believe. We have also with us Paul Williams. We're very, very happy to have Paul, who's the world's foremost expert on some of the issues we're discussing. And I had a privilege to meet Paul many years ago, I think in New York or somewhere in Africa. And we also have Bart Shevchuk with us. Bart who's with the German Marshall Fund office in Brussels, but also has been dealing with the issue of sanctions and issue of Russian assets for the last year and a half. So hopefully he can share some great insights. A wonderful panel of people to try to take on some of the challenges raised by Minister here. And maybe, Olena, if you can bridge the opening statements with some of the operational advocacy, the intergovernmental actions, activities that the Ukraine is undertaking currently in those issues, and, well, the barriers that you're facing and the challenges that you're seeing.
Thank you very much, Martin. Just a few hours before this panel discussion, I've seen the news, I guess it was published at the New York Times newspaper, that Russia is intensifying its propaganda and psychological operations in order to stop Western assistance for Ukraine. And unfortunately, we are hearing from our Western partners that we will stand with you as long as it takes. But then domestic elections come, and we are seeing that the issue of supporting Ukraine towards Ukrainian victory is increasingly becoming the domestic debate, the thing, for the discussion. And I think that this is incredibly unfair, that Ukraine's survival as the nation, as the sovereign state, is basically conditioned on the dynamics of someone's elections. And that is why we think that it's incredibly important to ask the very right question: what is the end game of our partners in this war? If the end game is victory, then all of the resources should be mobilized for the victory. And these funds, Russian central bank funds, they are incredibly important to ensure the sustainable assistance for Ukraine, because as Madam Minister put it very good, that Ukrainian government is working towards the development of the compensation mechanism, and there is this resolution of the UN General Assembly. Well, but we as the civil society, we think that we have to be even bolder and to demand the confiscation of Russian assets, not only for the compensation of the damages done, but to make sure that we do not have further damages, to make sure that Ukraine has all of the necessary tools for the self-defense. And here I would say that we see the three key pillars of obstacles, which from our perspectives are not obstacles at all. They are excuses, you know, and the biggest group is legal issues, and I know that there are very good groups that are working under the literally best lawyers, like Professor Tribe, who recently issued a 200-page long amazing legal study, and many others of the New Lines Institute, who are arguing like literally in details that sovereign immunity is not actually that big issue here, because sovereign immunity applies to the confiscation through court decisions. It does not regard the confiscation done by the executive decisions, like how the confiscation of the sovereign assets is supposed to take place when it is done. Minister Mudra explained very well in details about the attitude towards countermeasures. We've seen that the freezing of this $350 billion of the central bank assets, which was done in the very first days of the full-scale aggression, that measure, that step had the signs of the countermeasures. But ever since, in a year and a half, Russia has inflicted minimum 411 billion of damages calculated and estimated on the governmental controlled territories. We are not even speaking about the occupied territories, because Russia has the scorched earth tactics. When they retreat, they literally destroy everything on their way or behind their backs. So the damages, the costs would be much higher. And by the way, this calculation does not even include the Russian blowing up of the Kakhovka Dam, which was never ever punished. Not a single sanction was imposed for blowing, for the largest man-made catastrophe in decades on the Europe soil. So if freezing as the countermeasure was proportionate in the beginning of the full-scale war, then why not introducing proportionate countermeasures that are corresponding with the existing level of damages, destruction done by Russia? There's another approach. 2 more minutes. There's another approach that regards the concept of self-defense, because in its war, Russia systematically targets and aims at destroying our economy. They are destroying our energy infrastructure. What economy will run without energy, without electricity? They are destroying our port infrastructure, which is super important for the exports. I'm not even saying that, you know, that they are threatening the navigation in the Black Sea. So that is why imposing economic measures is an absolutely reasonable move. Another block bloc is economic threats, something which also Minister Mudra said, that third countries are afraid that their assets might be confiscated and they would repurpose their assets and send to other currencies. I'm sorry, which currencies they are going to send their assets? Chinese renminbi right now has 3% of all world reserves. Can it absorb the rest, 70%, which would, eventually come? Of course not. Moreover, China itself is even more unpredictable emittent of the reserve currencies. And, we know that renminbi is highly undervalued. We know that China has the capital controls. Chinese currency is not something very attractive to substitute dollar, euro, and yen. And we are not even speaking about Indian rupees, which are not convertible at all, and Russians cannot basically get their incomes from the trade on oil, which they are having right now. Political arguments, if there is a very clear set of criteria which proves that we are not confiscating Russian assets because we do not like Russia, but we are confiscating these assets because Russia has started the largest war of conquest on the Europe soil after the World War II, which has to be stopped, then it makes sense. And the very last point here, I would say that for all those, who think that we have sufficient resources or Russia is seeking for the peace, have you actually seen this draft defense budget, draft invasion budget of Russia for 2024? They are planning to increase it by 68%. They are not planning for any peace in the nearest future. They are planning to take Ukraine over. If the West is serious to defending and to saving Ukraine as the sovereign state, it's incredibly important to make sure that we have sufficient resources to win this war fast.
Thank you very. Yes, exactly. That was what was needed. Thank you very much, Olena. And these are important remarks, and I think a lot of things to touch upon. And while I believe, or I'm pretty confident, we won't find a person in the room who'd argue with, the moral case and actually argue with bold moves towards confiscating the assets and making them work for Ukraine. There's certainly a level of obstacles and barriers which we'd like to understand a bit more. And Paul, maybe I'm thinking about the U.S. now, where they had there was a proposal in Congress, the Repo Act, the U.S. which actually doesn't have that much of the assets, I think, compared to Europe, but holds probably the political key when it comes to the international financial system and the response of the banking system to this problem. Could you tell us what do you see as the biggest hurdle to overcome, or what are the ideas to move forward with this process? How are you seeing this?
Thank you for that question. I have to admit I'm highly tempted to simply associate myself with the remarks of Alana and the minister and then pass the microphone on to Bart. But you wouldn't invite me back. So I'll take a couple of minutes to sort of dive a little bit deeper into these questions, and specifically the question that you've asked me to address. I want to start by saying I think that everyone on the panel, everyone in the audience, everyone dialing in from the internet wants every last dollar, euro, ruble that's been seized to be repurposed to the people of Ukraine, both for reconstruction, but also for compensation for atrocity crimes. There was an earlier panel here today about how do you prosecute atrocity crimes. We also need to be thinking about how do we access this $500 billion to make reparations to those who've suffered from these crimes. Now, in order to do this, there's 5 or 6 different ways, which we could get into a little bit later in the hour: countermeasures, excise tax, creating an escrow account. But I think it's important, as Alana has mentioned, when you get the legal minds together with the political minds, for the political individuals to understand that there are real legal barriers to accomplishing these objectives. They're not insurmountable barriers. It will take substantial work by the parliaments, as the minister pointed out, to overcome them. And there's three that I would like to quickly highlight. The first is the reality that these Western capitalist states, which have the euro, which have the dollar, they're secure and they're prosperous because they adhere to the Lockean principles of the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Property is one of the triumvirate next to life and liberty that the Americans, the Europeans, and others have based their economic structure on. So when you go to pierce that right to property and seize and repurpose frozen assets, it shakes the entire economic foundation, or creates the perception of shaking the entire economic foundation of these prosperous economies. It can be overcome, but one has to have a very clear-eyed and strategic approach. The second is that the international world order, as dysfunctional as it is, up until this point, has served the interest of these liberal democracies and others, and it's based on sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity. And we can come back to territorial integrity later. But the sovereignty then has a parallel relationship to sovereign immunity. The states in the international community do a lot of things, some good, some bad, some nefarious, some evil, but they operate under this principle of sovereign immunity, and that's how they're able to structure the continuation of some degree of stability. Now, this has been pierced. In the United States, there's a Foreign Sovereign Immunity Act, which lays out, is essentially legislation, which lays out what states have sovereign immunity for. Interestingly, there's a commercial exception. If the state is involved in commercial activity, that can be pierced. It also lays out an exception for terrorism. The Americans should be seriously considering not necessarily designating Russia as a terrorist state, because that would jump Americans to the front of the queue for damages, but creating an exception to the Foreign Sovereign Immunity Act for the crime of aggression and these atrocity crimes that Russia is committing. And then the third barrier, and then I'll pass the mic to Bart, is that the legal regime which has been used to freeze these assets has been designed for an entirely different purpose. The regime has not been designed for reconstruction. It's been designed to change state behavior. And so the legal regime which instantaneously came into play was to freeze the assets. And the Americans and our European friends are very good at freezing assets. But the policy then is you freeze those assets until a state changes its behavior, and then you unfreeze those assets. And that's why that was able to implement so quickly. What we're all trying to work through here is a legal mechanism that takes those frozen assets, seizes and brings them into our accounts, and then repurposes them and hands them over to Ukraine. There is not yet a legal roadmap for doing that, and so we need to evolve the infrastructure of freezing assets to allow the seizure and then the repurposing of those assets. Three big barriers, they can be overcome, and I look forward to talking about ways in which that can happen.
We will get there with the next round for sure. But Bart, let's jump across the Atlantic over to Europe. And I think Ursula von der Leyen just before the summer, I don't know if it was London or someone mentioned that this is happening, that the EU is going to do it. And then I feel she took a step back, and there's been some talk of this stepwise approach. And some, let's say, mid-level ideas. So could you enlighten us a little bit what's actually happening in Brussels? What's the latest? There's a meeting in Granada happening this week. Will it address some of those issues? Please tell us, and then we'll try to figure out what to do.
Very happy to do so. Thank you very much. And the nice thing about going last after these distinguished panelists is that a lot of things that I wanted to say have already been said, so I can just pick a couple of specific issues. In terms of the state of play in Brussels and in the EU, there's a basic division within the Council of the EU among member states who are somewhat cautious and on this issue for a number of different reasons, be they legal or political or economic. And those are primarily driven by Germany and France. And then the other member states who are more proactive on this issue, and these are primarily Poland, the Baltic countries, and other countries in Central and Eastern Europe. But they haven't really driven the debate with as much force as they could have thus far. That might be shifting, but in any event, the Council is somewhat divided between those states which are a little bit cautious and those states which are a little bit more proactive. There is greater, surprisingly perhaps, greater initiative and energy right now in the European Parliament, which doesn't have a core sort of mandate in the first instance on these issues, but has issued a number of resolutions on this topic, including just 1 month after the full-scale invasion of last year, where the European Parliament invoked Article 51 of the UN Charter and its collective self-defense clause in calling on EU member states to provide weapons to Ukraine and to share intelligence with Ukraine. I'll come back to why this is important in a second. Right now, the European Parliament is negotiating and amending the regulation establishing the Ukraine facility, which, as you may have seen in the news, is basically a 50 billion euro top-up, budgetary top-up to the EU budget to provide continued funding and support for Ukraine. Now, in this regulation, as of a few days ago, there's a new recital that's been proposed that invokes two international legal doctrines for the purposes of confiscating Russian state assets. And those are collective countermeasures on the one hand, and Minister Mulda referred to this already, and then collective self-defense on the other hand. And she also invoked self-defense measures as justification for why Russian state assets, which ordinarily in times of peace, in normal times, would be accorded sovereign immunity, are not accorded sovereign immunity and can be confiscated. Now, the important thing is that now you will have on the books, as a matter of EU law, true as a matter of recital, but still on the EU books, an invocation of both collective countermeasures and collective self-defense as legal bases for confiscating Russian state assets. And then the ball will be passed back to the Council with perhaps some additional movement there. Now, going back to President von der Leyen, you know, the Commission will propose new policy measures, but very sensitive to what is coming in terms of political signals from the capitals, primarily, especially from, you know, large countries such as Germany and France. And so the real debate to be had is in these two countries. And to the extent that you can see a policy shift in these capitals, then I think you will see a shift at the EU level. Now, let me just mention a couple more things before I pass back the mic. In France itself, there has been a little bit of movement, not because of the very persuasive international legal arguments that we've hashed out already over the past few months, but because French businesses have started to become expropriated by the Kremlin, and with real impact, you know, in the billions of euro, companies like Danone and others, and so, you know, there is a realization here that not only has Russia waged aggressive war, has killed innocent civilians, has committed crimes against humanity, but it's also, you know, now flouting every single rule under the sun. It's expropriating French and European businesses in Russia, and that just provides additional ammunition, political rationale for going ahead with confiscating Russian state assets. In the end, you know, a lot of these legal complexities are actually not that difficult, not that insurmountable. And, you know, there are papers by Larry Tribe and lots of others who make a full-fledged case for why this can be done. It is a matter of political will, but I think the political will eventually arrive at the point of confiscation, because not only is the moral case so strong, but also the political imperative is going to become stronger and stronger. You know, as you have resource constraints in even wealthy countries like Germany, France, others, the United States, after providing tens of billions of euros and dollars to Ukraine, the question will arise, which is a legitimate question, should the continued responsibility fall on European taxpayers, American taxpayers, Canadian, British, and so on, or should it, in the first instance, fall on the Kremlin? And the answer is obvious, that it should fall on the Kremlin. Now, don't worry, there's plenty of reconstruction to be done. And so, even if we confiscate the 200 or 300 billion dollars of Russian state assets across the world, that will still not be enough to compensate Ukraine for the damage that's already occurred, let alone if this war lasts even longer. And so, I think the case the legal case is quite strong. You'll have, bring it to international lawyers into the room, you'll get 5 opinions. And so I'm sure you'll find international lawyers who will, put a greater weight on the scales of sovereign immunity and so forth. But the legal case is quite strong. The moral case is overwhelming, and the political imperative is going to start catching up with capitals across Europe and across the world.
Olena, are you feeling this? That there's the change in capitals coming from your meetings, from your advocacy actions. What's the latest there?
Well, no, my feeling is actually that there's absolutely no appetite. And, well, we've initiated several meetings on this topic and here at the conference, and we've seen not that much interest, to be honest. And if we are speaking to capitals in the European Union, they are pointing the finger at Brussels. Then we are going, to Brussels. They are sending us back to Berlin and well, mostly to Berlin, because you first have to convince them they are blocking everything. When we speak, to the US, we hear the argument that there's just some peanuts, 8 billion or something like that. But the issue is that very similarly to all of the other types of assistance which we've received, we only can move forward in coalitions. We need G7 plus EU confiscation coalition. And we need leaders of this coalition, because every coalition started with somebody super brave, offering and putting forward the idea which others were terrified with. And even, the funniest thing is even the Leopard 2 coalition started with British decision to give us Challenger tanks. Kind of ironic thing, but it's how it worked. So what we need right now is this G7 plus EU coalition with, Canada has done a number of steps, but they stuck and they are not moving forward. So they have legislation, but that legislation is not yet implemented. So from my perspective is we still need to generate this political will. And because of that, we started with our International Center for Ukrainian Victory, a very big Make Russia Pay campaign. And together with the invitation of Ukraine to NATO in DC summit, that would probably be our 2 biggest focuses, because, it's about sustainability and it's about our survival.
Thank you. Thank you, Olena. So, yes, definitely. Paul, how, do we raise this political will? I would say, how do we, give the ammunition, the legal ammunition? And I know you've mentioned you've had some ideas, but we want to hear them. But I also want to ask about something that's been really intriguing me. This does not sound to me like an issue that is a political threat in terms of the elections and the electorates. Or if it is, tell me where. Where is it in Washington? Where is it in Berlin? Something that voters will actually care about. It seems to me that this is a flip side. You can show that you're actually, not spending money out of your coffers, which would normally go for healthcare and for other things. So this seems to me like a double win. Don't get me wrong, I understand the difficulty, but we've crossed a lot of lines which a year and a half wouldn't be there. So maybe you can enlighten us a little bit. What's behind this?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of ideas. I think what's behind it is a lack of political creativity in terms of how to take this issue and make it resonate with the American population. I think the American population is deeply committed to Ukrainian victory. In my neighborhood, you still see Ukrainian flags and every other flagpole along with the American flag. But the politicians haven't figured out how to turn it into a political message. And there's a couple of ways of doing it. The first would be, and this would meld with the legal as well, go after the oligarchs. Now, I know it's a tiny amount of money compared to the central bank assets, but under the legal regime, it's much easier to freeze an asset and then convert an oligarch's asset into funds that are repurposed to Ukraine, because the Americans are quite big on taking the yachts and the boats and the planes of drug lords and drug dealers from our decades of dealing with that situation, and you can roll the oligarch's assets directly into that legal mechanism. Now, it's less important the amount of money that will be transferred, but it starts to build that momentum. It starts to show that you can navigate or overcome these barriers. And politically, you can say, look, this is ill-gotten gain. Nobody believes these oligarchs actually earned this money in order to buy these football teams, European friends, these football teams, and these yachts and these other types of luxury resources, take them away visibly, publicly, aggressively, give that money to the Ukrainians and say, central bank assets, we're coming after you next. And so you begin to create that. The second thing you can do, which is also illegal but has the political, is take the frozen assets and instead of seizing them, put them in an escrow account. And that way, and this is where you were talking about an executive as opposed to a judicial function, essentially say, we're going to work to get this money to Ukraine. But as of today, this money will never be Russian money. And that would show and resonate with the American population, the commitment of the American political infrastructure to punishing the Russians in a way that will help the Ukrainians win the war, and then teeing up eventual transfer of those funds for the reconstruction and for compensation and reparations for atrocity crimes.
Bart, go ahead. You had a reaction.
Just one reaction, which is, the timing of when Russia pays. Everyone agrees that Russia must pay, and then sometimes people say, well, we should set up this elaborate reparation process as part of a longer peace agreement, and we should keep the assets frozen as a leverage point to in the future negotiations over peace. And it's an attractive argument, and there's a logic to it. But let me give you the rebuttal to it, which is that imagine in this future scenario a peace-loving, Ukraine-friendly, pro-Western government in the Kremlin. Now, I don't know when that will take place, whether a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, whenever it is. But at that point, is that the ideal time to impose a high bill of 400 billion euro or 600 billion euro or whatever the damage is that Russia has inflicted on Ukraine, versus imposing that bill on Russia right now as part of our overall economic warfare with respect to Russia, and to compel them to stop fighting. Olena mentioned that they're ramping up their aggression budget, their military budget by 68%, whatever it is. So they're not backing down. And the more economic pressure that we can generate now with respect to Russia, the better. And so that's the timing issue. Everyone under the sun agrees that Russia must pay at some point. I think this case is stronger that it must pay now rather than at some point down the line as part of peace negotiations, because we are still trying to come up with any measure possible to exert pressure against them. One point on coalition building, and I'm glad you're engaged in this effort. It's true. It's one of these frustrating debates because, in some ways, the political imperative is so clear, the legal challenges can be overcome, and so you sort of wonder, why hasn't it been done already 12 months ago or 14 months ago when these assets were frozen? By the way, freezing these assets is also, a caveat to sovereign immunity, where normally these assets would be allowed to go freely wherever they want in the world. So whoever tells you, sovereign immunity, well, they have a problem because these assets have been frozen or immobilized over the past 19 months. And so that is already on the books. But in terms of coalition building, the Canadian government, as I understand, in light of President Zelensky's recent visit to Canada, is working on setting up a task force to engage in this type of outreach and coalition building diplomatic engagement effort, because they do have a law on the books. They're the only ones right now. And so they're looking for additional partners in the EU and UK and other G7 partners to do this. And then it's a matter of, building up the political pressure in Berlin, in Paris, to sort of walk through the legal challenges, but also the legal solutions to those challenges, and to help identify for policymakers the legally viable paths. If I could just 10 more seconds, I think the crux of the problem right now is that sometimes the issue gets stuck between legal bureaucracies in various capitals, which can take one or another position on the issue, and then policymakers who say, well, we don't really understand these legal complexities, and we will just defer to the bureaucracy. Whereas in fact, the way customary international law, which is a body of law that regulates this area of conduct, it's very much dependent on policymaking and state practice out of a sense of legal obligation. And so it's very much the responsibility of policymakers to come up with rules that are sensible, that are responsive to the current moment. And the current moment is, there's ongoing damage in Ukraine. Someone must pay for it. Russia is that someone, and should do it now rather than later.
Thanks very much. Yes, I was about to ask the room if they want to weigh in into this conversation. I see two hands. Do we have a mic here? I see a third hand. Okay, let's get 3 questions, please, because we don't have much time. So first the lady in orange, and then the gentleman, and then the lady in white.
Hi, so I want to get into a little bit of the economics behind...
Sorry, can you introduce yourself?
I'm Melissa Murphy, so I am a recent graduate from MIT, and I did a fellowship with Harvard Law, and I'm a specialist in banking and economics for foreign security. And I have a question, not so much about the FISA arguments with the commercial exception or the terrorist exception of how you would actually move to asset seizure and forfeiture, but more so the exposure of what those 500 billion have today in the commercial markets. What do you think the exposure is to banks in terms of capital allocation and risk? And is there a need to mitigate that when things start moving around?
Hello, everyone. Sibran de Jong, Senior Analyst, NATO SHAPE, NATO Military's headquarters. I got a question on, so you already see right now that Russia is moving to confiscate or expropriate otherwise Western assets inside Russia. Now, my question is how, or actually what kind of legal tools are available to prevent that we kind of get into this endless sort of tit for tat whereby we expropriate A, they counter with B, and so on and so on. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Milena Sterio. I'm an international law professor in the United States and also managing director at the Public International Law and Policy Group. Quick question for the panelists on the international law side. I think we can talk about the political will. We can talk about, obviously this is the right thing to do for Russia to pay. But what about the international law framework for confiscating and then repurposing Russian assets to pay for reconstruction? I don't think we have much precedent on that. And are we in a situation where we're simply creating new international law norms? And if we're doing that, how do we go about that? And is there a danger that this will backfire, that this type of a regime could then be abused and misused by other states in the future against, yet other states? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Please, to the panel. Yes, I think we can talk about...
We should embrace change. So yes, we are looking at evolving and rapidly evolving the international legal framework. I think as we've realized, the legal framework has a massive hole in the middle of it for when a country commits aggression, commits these type of atrocity crimes. I think there's two ways of approaching this. One would be to do a treaty, some conversation among the EU plus the G7, EU plus G7, where you would design these infrastructures and do it in a thoughtful and comprehensive way so that you can actually seize the frozen assets and repurpose them and minimize the type of negative consequences. A second way would be to think of this as a Groschian moment. As Bart had pointed out, customary international law evolves through state practice and opinio juris. It takes a really long time. We don't have time to do that now. There are 4 or 5 instances of instant customary international law or so-called Groschian moments where a legal framework can be developed through state practice. Again, EU plus G7 can make it regional, customary international law, and opinio juris. Most lawyers will tell you, yes, this is the right thing to do. There are just these barriers that have to be navigated. That is a little less precise and more risky than a treaty, but it is something that the legal minds that Elena and others have been talking about could come together. States could begin to announce this instant customary international law to pierce sovereign immunity, because as Bart has mentioned, we pierced it when we froze the assets. Let's just push it a little bit further.
Thanks very much. Bart, you want to take on one of the questions?
I'll briefly add
Sorry,
here
go ahead.
that, well, you know, as the response to the last largest war, which took place, World War II, basically, you know, the entire, this international law system was developed. And if it did not manage to prevent another big war, another big aggression, then it is the right thing to recognize that something is wrong and needs to be fixed. And we shouldn't be seeing, you know, the international law as something static. And to be honest, when I'm meeting governmental officials from, let's say, Switzerland or Austria, countries that are neutral, and when I'm telling about Russian atrocities, crimes, and I hear the argument which sounds like, yes, Russia is gravely violating the law. Russia is doing very bad things, but we cannot violate the law because Russia is violating. It's like, no, this is not virtue to, you know, be wearing white coat. The virtue is to recognize that something is very wrong and needs to be fixed. And I think that it also requires the courage to do this. And on your second part, whether this instrument won't be abused, I would say maybe vice versa. Maybe having this instrument would be actually the safeguards against aggressions. Because to be honest, autocrats are watching Western response at this war. And they are very carefully weighing in all of the advantages and disadvantages. And if they are seeing, you know, that they can massacre and destroy entire town Mariupol, and then everybody will be preoccupied how to protect sovereign rights of the aggressors, because it's impossible, because its immunity would be violated, whatever. As a potential aggressor, I would be celebrating this.
I think it's a very important point that either way we're setting a precedent here. Either we're going to set a precedent that even if you're an aggressor state and you wage a war of aggression, commit crimes against humanity, your assets will be shielded. Don't worry, you know, no one will touch them. Or we will set a precedent that in the very limited case of a war of aggression and crimes against humanity, your assets will not be shielded under this customary doctrine of sovereign immunity, which makes sense in peacetime as part of the regular international order, but doesn't make sense in times of wars of aggression. Now, to tie back to the question about, okay, what will happen in terms of other flows of sovereign assets and whether, for instance, China, sometimes people say, well, China will pull out all of its assets from the West and move it elsewhere. Well, one response is where are those assets going to go? There's a reason why China has diversified assets around the world, and there's a good underlying economic and financial reason. Second, there is already a risk that the assets will be immobilized in the event, let's say, China commits aggression, because we've done so with respect to Russian assets. And third, let's say all of a sudden China would decide to pull out its assets from Western financial capitals in light of us confiscating Russian state assets. What signal would that send to the world, right, about its own intentions over the medium or long-term future? And they probably wouldn't want to do that. So my sense is that the financial risk, the economic risk of the West confiscating Russian state assets is actually either already baked into the financial markets or is going to be quite limited, because, there are bad and not so great states, but there aren't a lot of states bent on waging wars of aggression and committing crimes against humanity across their neighbors and others. And so, I think this risk is sometimes a little bit overblown, but it's part of the panoply of considerations that policymakers should take into account. In the end, across the various categories, political, economic, legal, the case is quite strong, and so I think that your coalition building will help move the needle. And I think it is frustrating because you sort of get sent to different policymakers, but in the parliament now there's a pretty strong center of gravity in favor of confiscation. In the council, hopefully there'll be further movement, and to the extent that you can convince policymakers in Germany and France in particular, that will get it over the hump.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, there is a lot of work ahead of us, but I think that the fruit maybe is not low-hanging, but it's close there. This is my feeling from this discussion, and I think we could spend the next few days unpacking this and working on this, and hopefully this will be happening, especially with this wonderful group here. Please thank very much our wonderful panelists. And let's go get that Russian money.